At 0437 hours local time, the radar installations at Andersen Air Force Base went dark, not gradually, not sequentially, not in the cascading pattern of technical malfunction, but simultaneously every emitter, every receiver, every backup system rendered operationally inert in a window measured in milliseconds. What the duty officers in the command center were witnessing was not equipment failure requiring maintenance response. It was the opening phase of an operational sequence that had been rehearsed in simulation environments for 7 years and refined through progressive capability validation exercises that Western intelligence agencies categorized as routine training until 3 hours ago when the training became execution. The electromagnetic warfare cascade that preceded the kinetic phase achieved suppression of detection and tracking capability across the entire Western Pacific theater from the Mariana Archipelago to the northern Philippines in a coordination feat that required synchronization of 463 distinct emitters operating from land installations, naval platforms, and aerospace vehicles in a distributed architecture that defeated defensive systems designed explicitly to counter coordinated electromagnetic attack. The darkness lasted 18 minutes, long enough for the primary strike package to achieve terminal positioning, short enough that American command authorities assumed they were experiencing sophisticated electronic warfare rather than comprehensive targeting preparation for what would follow. By 0500 hours, when defensive radar systems achieved partial restoration through backup power and alternative frequency allocation, the airspace signature that appeared on reconstructed displays contained so many individual returns that senior controllers initially assumed the system restoration had introduced catastrophic ghost imaging artifacts. What they were observing was not a software error, it was 1,500 J-20 fifth-generation stealth fighters operating in coordinated strike packages whose electromagnetic signature had been deliberately unmasked only after achieving attack geometry that rendered defensive intercept operationally impossible within the engagement timeline. If this channel delivers the strategic clarity that institutional media systematically withholds, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support keeps this analysis independent and unfiltered. How did Chinese Aerospace Command achieve coordination of 1,500 advanced combat aircraft across a theater spanning 3 million square kilometers without detection during the approach phase? What specific technical characteristics of the J-20 platform enabled simultaneous stealth penetration and coordinated electromagnetic unmasking that defeated layered air defense architectures? How does the complete destruction of Andersen Air Force Base as a functional military installation reshape American force projection capability in the Western Pacific when that base represented the primary logistics hub and staging platform for every contingency scenario in the theater? What decision matrix confronts Pentagon leadership when the carrier battle groups that would normally constitute the response force are operationally stranded without air cover in engagement envelopes now dominated by an adversary with demonstrated willingness to conduct comprehensive offensive operations? What does the strategic landscape of the Indo-Pacific look like when the foundational assumption of American escalation dominance has been invalidated in a 19-minute engagement window that eliminated the forward basing infrastructure upon which every alliance commitment depended? These questions define the analytical framework for understanding not just what occurred in the skies above Guam in the early hours of this morning, but what it means for the entire architecture of American military presence in a region that contains 40% of global economic output and 60% of humanity. The tactical chronology of the Andersen strike begins not at 0437 when electromagnetic warfare activation commenced, but at 0215 when coordinated submarine operations achieved acoustic suppression of American undersea detection capabilities in the Philippine Sea. Chinese Type 093B attack submarines operating in wolfpack formations deployed low-frequency acoustic generators that created interference patterns overwhelming the SOSUS array network that provides the foundational layer of American maritime domain awareness in the Western Pacific. The acoustic suppression created corridors through which surface action groups could maneuver without detection, positioning Type 055 destroyers equipped with extended-range surface-to-air missiles at intervals calculated to provide overlapping engagement envelopes that would deny American air reinforcement from Eastern Pacific bases during the critical phase of the Andersen operation. The electromagnetic warfare activation at 0437 represented the transition from positioning to execution, with ground-based systems in the Fujian and Guangdong military regions, ship-based electronic attack capabilities from 17 surface combatants, and airborne electronic warfare aircraft, all transmitting on coordinated frequencies that achieved constructive interference patterns specifically calibrated to defeat the signal processing algorithms of ANFPS 132 early warning radar systems deployed at Anderson and subsidiary installations throughout the Mariana Chain. The simultaneous failure of primary and backup radar systems was not accident or lucky timing. It was the product of seven-generation evolution in Chinese electronic warfare doctrine, beginning with rudimentary jamming capabilities in the late 1990s and culminating in the distributed, coherent electromagnetic attack architecture that achieved complete suppression of American detection capability across a theater measured in millions of square kilometers. At 0441, the first J-20 strike packages achieved launch positions for the PL-15 extended-range air-to-air missiles that would clear the airspace of the 8 F-22 Raptors that had managed to achieve scramble launch before electromagnetic suppression disabled ground control systems. The engagement geometry was mathematically precise, with each American fighter facing coordinated engagement from between 6 and 9 J-20s, operating in hunter-killer formations that allocated primary shooter, backup shooter, and terminal guidance roles according to doctrinal protocols refined through thousands of simulator iterations. The F-22s never achieved radar lock on their attackers. The combination of J-20 stealth characteristics and coordinated electronic attack meant that American pilots were defending against threat vectors they could identify only through launch detection systems, warning them of missiles already in terminal guidance phase. All 8 American aircraft were destroyed between 0441 and 0446. Their pilots never achieved situational awareness sufficient to employ their own weapons. They died defending an installation that was already operationally destroyed by an attack they never saw, coming from an adversary whose approach they never detected. At 0453, the second wave began the ground attack phase. 120 J-20s carrying precision-guided munitions executed coordinated strikes against runway infrastructure, hardened aircraft shelters, fuel storage facilities, ammunition bunkers, radar installations, command and control nodes, barracks facilities, and every other target category that transforms an airbase from a piece of real estate into an operational military asset. The munitions employed were not the massive penetrator weapons designed for deeply buried targets. They were smaller precision weapons optimized for creating permanent operational disruption of complex interconnected systems. A runway can be repaired in hours if the damage is merely cratering. It cannot be repaired in months when the underlying structure has been destroyed and the repair equipment has been eliminated and the personnel who would conduct repairs have been killed and the logistics infrastructure that would supply materials has been comprehensively targeted. By 0512, when the final strike package departed the engagement area, Anderson Air Force Base existed as a geographic location, but not as a functioning element of American military infrastructure. The J-20 Mighty Dragon represents the culmination of a 30-year program that began not with the aircraft itself, but with the comprehensive technical intelligence collection operation that mapped every aspect of American fifth-generation fighter development from the F-22 program through the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. The development timeline that Western analysts consistently underestimated as aspirational rather than achievable was enabled by systematic acquisition of technical data through signals intelligence collection, human intelligence operations within defense contractor organizations, cyber intrusion operations against protected networks, and analysis of physical materials obtained through third-party acquisition of F-35 components from international partners with inadequate security protocols. Every technical parameter that defines fifth-generation capability, low observable shaping that defeats radar detection, sensor fusion that creates comprehensive battle space awareness, data link networking that enables coordinated operations, advanced avionics that reduce pilot workload, supercruise capability that enables sustained supersonic flight without afterburner, all were incorporated into the J-20 design, not through indigenous innovation in a vacuum, but through systematic study of American solutions to identical technical challenges, followed by indigenous engineering adaptation that produced functionally equivalent capability without direct component copying that would have been vulnerable to supply chain interdiction. The aircraft achieved initial operational capability in 2017, a timeline that Pentagon planning assumptions considered impossible given the technical complexity involved, Those assumptions proved wrong because they were premised on the belief that Chinese aerospace engineering lacked the institutional depth and technical sophistication to solve the fundamental challenges of fifth-generation aircraft development. The assumption was false, the institutional capability was real, and the consequence of that analytical failure is visible in the wreckage burning on Guam this morning. The J-20's power plant evolution illustrates the development methodology that enabled the program to achieve deployment at scale, despite Western sanctions designed to prevent exactly that outcome. The initial production variants employed Russian-supplied AL-31F engines, adequate for demonstrating airframe characteristics, but insufficient for the sustained supersonic cruise that defines true fifth-generation performance. Chinese aerospace engineers did not accept this limitation as permanent. They initiated a parallel development program for the WS-10C Taihang engine that achieved the thrust-to-weight ratio and thermal management characteristics required for supercruise capability. The WS-10C development faced skepticism from Western technical analysts who assumed Chinese metallurgy and precision manufacturing capability remained inadequate for producing turbine components capable of sustained operation at the temperatures and rotational speeds required. This skepticism proved as unfounded as the earlier assumptions about airframe development capability. The WS-10C entered production in 2019 and enabled the J-20 to achieve performance parity with the F-22 in the specific parameters that matter for the Anderson engagement scenario: sustained supersonic cruise enabling rapid transit to engagement area, sufficient thrust for vertical maneuvering in beyond visual range combat, and electromagnetic signature management that prevents engine heat from compromising stealth characteristics. The current production variant employs the WS-15 engine, an even more advanced power plant that provides thrust vectoring capability and further reduces infrared signature. The progression from imported Russian engines through indigenous first generation to advanced second generation power plants occurred in a 12-year window, a development pace that no Western technical assessment projected as achievable. The operational doctrine governing J-20 employment was developed not in isolation but through systematic study of American air operations from Desert Storm through the Syrian intervention, with particular focus on how the United States employs stealth aircraft in the opening phases of conflicts to achieve air superiority that enables follow-on conventional operations. Chinese military theorists concluded that American air campaign doctrine relies on several predictable sequencing elements: initial suppression of enemy air defenses using stealth platforms, establishment of air superiority through destruction of opposing fighter forces and ground-based air defense systems, deployment of airborne early warning and control aircraft to coordinate follow-on operations, and progressive expansion of operational tempo as resistance capability degrades. The doctrine developed for J-20 employment inverts this sequence. Rather than employing stealth for progressive attrition of defending forces, the doctrine envisions concentrated application of overwhelming numbers of stealth platforms in coordinated strike packages that achieve comprehensive destruction of enemy operational capability before defensive response can be organized. The Anderson strike represented execution of this doctrine at the scale for which it was designed. 1,500 aircraft is not a number generated by incremental force expansion. It is the specific force structure required to execute simultaneous strikes against every critical node in the American Western Pacific basing network while maintaining reserves for defensive counter-air operations against any American response. The scale of the deployment answered a question that Western analysts had debated for years: whether China would employ the J-20 primarily as a defensive interceptor, protecting Chinese airspace, or as an offensive strike platform, enabling power projection. The answer arrived at 0437 Guam local time. The J-20 is an offensive weapon designed for operational execution at a scale that overwhelms rather than evades defensive systems. The strategic planning that enabled the Anderson operation extends back through multiple decades of progressive capability development and institutional preparation that Western sanctions regimes and diplomatic pressure operations were designed to prevent but instead accelerated. Every restriction on Chinese access to Western aerospace technology became a forcing function that drove indigenous development programs that produced capabilities immune to supply chain interdiction. Every international pressure campaign designed to isolate Chinese defense industries created incentives for self-sufficiency that transformed short-term vulnerabilities into long-term strategic advantages. The electromagnetic warfare capability that achieved comprehensive radar suppression was developed because American export restrictions prevented Chinese access to advanced electronic warfare systems. The restriction that was intended to preserve American technological advantage instead ensured that Chinese electronic warfare development would proceed independently and therefore incorporate technical approaches that American defensive systems were not designed to counter. The J-20 production infrastructure that enabled manufacturing of 1,500 aircraft was developed because international arms embargoes prevented Chinese access to foreign aircraft that could have satisfied Air Force modernization requirements. The embargo that was intended to constrain Chinese air power instead ensured that Chinese air power would be built on indigenous industrial base that no external pressure could disrupt. The operational security that concealed the scale of J-20 deployment was developed because Western intelligence collection operations created persistent threat of capability revelation, the intelligence pressure that was intended to provide early warning of Chinese capability development, instead drove operational security innovations that prevented Western collection until the capability was employed operationally. The pattern is consistent across every dimension of the program. External pressure designed to prevent capability development instead created the conditions under which that capability was developed indigenously, made resilient against external disruption, and employed with operational surprise that defeated defensive preparations premised on intelligence assessments that proved comprehensively wrong. The preparation timeline for the specific Anderson operation began approximately 7 years before execution, when Chinese military planners conducted the comprehensive war game series that modeled Western Pacific contingencies under various assumptions about American force posture and response capabilities. The war games identified Anderson as the critical node whose elimination would create irreversible operational advantage in the opening phase of any Pacific conflict. Without Anderson as a logistics hub and forward basing platform, American carrier battle groups would be forced to operate from Eastern Pacific bases, reducing their time on station and increasing vulnerability during transit through engagement envelopes dominated by Chinese land-based aviation and submarine forces. American air reinforcement from Hawaii and the continental United States would lack intermediate refueling and rearming capability, making sustained operations impossible. And Allied forces in Japan and South Korea would be operationally isolated without the coordination hub that Anderson provided for joint operations. The identification of Anderson as the critical vulnerability drove the specific capability development that would be required to execute the strike. The J-20 force structure determination of 1,500 aircraft was derived from the wargame requirement to achieve simultaneous suppression of air defenses, destruction of defensive air patrol forces, and comprehensive attack against ground targets within a window short enough to prevent effective response. The electromagnetic warfare architecture was developed to achieve the radar suppression that would enable approach without detection, and the Type 055 destroyer deployment that created the anti-air umbrella preventing American reinforcement was sized to provide coverage sufficient to protect the strike force during ingress and egress. Every element was developed not opportunistically, but as components of an integrated operational system designed to execute a specific mission. What occurred this morning was not improvisation or exploitation of unexpected opportunity. It was execution of a plan that had been refined through simulation and validated through progressive exercises over a 7-year development cycle. Pentagon leadership confronts a decision environment that offers no acceptable options and multiple pathways to catastrophic outcome. The immediate military response options are constrained by the operational reality that the capability required to execute those options no longer exists in theater. Retaliatory strikes against Chinese military installations on the mainland would require carrier-based aviation operating without the forward basing support that Anderson provided, forcing the carriers into engagement envelopes where Chinese land-based aviation now enjoys numerical superiority. In the J-20 force that just destroyed Anderson remains available for defensive counter-air operations. The carrier commanders who would be ordered to execute such strikes have already communicated through back-channel military-to-military contacts that they consider the operation a suicide mission that would result in loss of multiple carriers without achieving meaningful military effect. Missile strikes from submarines would avoid the vulnerability of surface forces, but would exhaust available inventory of cruise missiles without eliminating the Chinese capability that produced the Anderson attack, and would risk escalation to nuclear exchange if Chinese early warning systems interpreted the submarine-launched missile signatures as potential nuclear first strike. Conventional ballistic missile strikes from continental United States bases face similar escalation risks, with added complication that they would require overfly of Russian or neutral airspace, creating diplomatic crisis on top of military crisis. The constrained option set facing civilian leadership is even worse than the military alternatives. Accepting the attack without military response preserves the lives of military personnel who would die in futile retaliation attempts, but communicates to every ally in the Pacific that American security guarantees are void when challenged by a peer adversary willing to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives, negotiated settlement that acknowledges Chinese operational success in exchange for cessation of hostilities, concedes the Western Pacific as a Chinese sphere of influence, and invites every revisionist power globally to test whether American responses to aggression are universally constrained or specifically constrained in the Pacific theater. And mobilization for extended conflict requires domestic political consensus that does not exist and economic reorientation that would take years to achieve, while the immediate crisis demands decisions measured in hours. The decision paralysis is not the product of incompetent leadership. It is the structural consequence of confronting a situation where the adversary has achieved comprehensive operational surprise and eliminated the military capabilities upon which every contingency plan depended. The global implications extend across every theater where American security commitments depend on credible power projection capability. European allies observing the Anderson destruction understand that NATO collective defense guarantees rest on American ability to deploy overwhelming conventional forces to Eastern Europe in crisis scenarios. That deployment capability depends on logistics, infrastructure, and force concentration that the Chinese just demonstrated can be eliminated in a coordinated strike. If American forward bases in the Pacific can be destroyed despite decades of investment in air defense and early warning systems, then American forward bases in Europe face identical vulnerability to Russian capabilities that have been developed with equal attention to American defensive weaknesses. Japanese and South Korean security establishments recognize that their national defense strategies are premised on American ability to provide air cover and naval support in the opening hours of conflict with North Korea or China. Those assumptions are now operationally invalid. Both nations face immediate decisions about whether to pursue indigenous nuclear weapons development or accept accommodation with Chinese regional dominance. Taiwan understands that American congressional commitments to defend the island are meaningless when the military capability to execute that defense has been eliminated. Reunification is no longer a question of if, but when and under what terms. Middle Eastern partners who have oriented their strategic positioning around American military presence recognize that Chinese achievement of operational surprise in the Pacific creates incentives for Russia and Iran to test whether American commitments in their region face similar constraints. The cascading credibility implications are not theoretical future concerns. They are immediate operational realities that every government is incorporating into security calculations being made in emergency cabinet sessions, convening right now in capitals across 6 continents. The fires burning on Guam are not the fires of a temporary setback requiring operational adjustment and reconstitution of damaged capabilities. They are the fires of an ending, the ending of the 75-year period during which American forward basing networks and carrier battle groups represented the unanswerable argument in any Pacific security competition. What strategic architecture replaces that foundation? How allies recalibrate their security calculations when American conventional superiority has been demonstrated as contingent rather than assured? Whether the Pentagon can reconstitute credible power projection in a theater where the adversary has demonstrated both capability and willingness to conduct comprehensive offensive operations. These are the questions that will define the next generation of international security politics. Can American military planning reconstitute forward presence in the Western Pacific when the infrastructure that enabled that presence has been comprehensively destroyed and the adversary retains the capability to repeat the attack against any reconstitution attempt? Or has the strategic equation shifted permanently in ways that no procurement program or operational adjustment can reverse within decision time frames that matter? Share your assessment in the comments below. If this breakdown delivered analysis that institutional media will not provide because it contradicts preferred narratives about American military invincibility, share this video, hit like and subscribe. The conversation that this moment demands happens here, in this community, not in the institutions whose analytical frameworks the Anderson operation just invalidated. This story is entering a phase whose outcome remains genuinely uncertain. The decisions being made in Beijing, Washington, Tokyo, and every other capital with stakes in Pacific stability will determine whether we are witnessing a singular demonstration of Chinese capability or the opening phase of a comprehensive reordering of regional power dynamics. We will be tracking every development, analyzing every consequence, delivering the clarity that makes sense of what is unfolding. Stay sharp, stay informed. We will see you in the next breakdown.